What I want to talk about today is fishing, and I want to talk about cod, which I know is a very fish close to the Icelandic heart, and it's close to the Newfoundland heart and the Eastern Canadian heart. And what I want to talk about in the broad sense is what has happened to the Newfoundland cod. I want to talk about the fishery for Newfoundland cod, so I will spend some time in the history, and you might see some parallels to the Icelandic cod situation, fishery. Describe the collapse, and then discuss some reasons for why things haven't rebounded or recovered in the way that we thought. Now, this slide shows the catches of cod from the early 1500s to 1992 when the fishery was closed. And I will show this type of picture several times, so you will see it more than once, but it shows the estimated catch of cod from Newfoundland, what we call the northern cod, from its earliest days to, as I say, 1992. And for comparison with Icelandic cod catches over the last 5 years, Icelandic cod catches have been between 200 and 250,000 tons. So I think actually that is pretty close to what should have been sustainable for the northern cod situation in Canada. But that gives you some comparison. As I say, I'll come back to this slide more than once. So from a historical perspective, the Newfoundland fishery began in the late 1400s, and it was a migratory fishery, meaning that there was nobody living in Newfoundland who fished cod at that time. Well, there was no one living in Newfoundland of European origin, but there were Aboriginal peoples living there. But they tended to fish for salmon. And this migratory fishery began with the Basques from northern Spain and southern France, the Portuguese, the French, and the English. So by 1525, by 1530, all of these 4 countries were involved in a migratory fishery. They would travel across the Atlantic in March and depart again in September with salted cod. Now, the English preferred to salt their cod on shore. So they would bring their catch to the coast and they would salt the cod. You can see it lying on this flake, what we call a flake here. The French, the Portuguese, and the Basques tended to salt their cod offshore in barrels. And this ship shows you or gives you an idea of the type of ship that was used at the time. And it's difficult to blow this up, but these 4 things here represent places where, or it's meant to be a diagram, a representation of the fact that as most fishermen of that time, when they were fishing offshore, they would stand in coveralls that were waterproof and lower hooks into the ocean from the vessel. So the primary gear, the primary technology at that time, and right up until the 1850s, was hook and line. A hook, and you can see that these hooks were fairly big, 5 centimeters. It's a reasonably sized hook, so they were fishing big fish. And these hooks were typically baited with something. So hook and line gear was the primary gear for the first 350 years of the fishery. From 1600 to 1700, the Spanish, the Basques, the Portuguese were no longer part of that fishery, primarily because of different wars and different problems in that context. And it was mainly a French and English migratory fishery. But it was also the beginning of a local inshore fishery, because it was in 1610 that the companies who controlled the migratory fishery allowed people to settle on the island of Newfoundland. And so now we had an inshore fishery, a coastal fishery, prosecuted by Newfoundlanders. From 1700 to 1900, the next 200 years, we still had the French and the English migratory fishery. We had the Newfoundlanders and now the Canadians were fishing, and at the time Newfoundland was a separate country. It did not become part of Canada until 1949. And the US started to fish the waters as well. There was a change in the gear that was used. And in Newfoundland, starting in about 1854, 1855, was the development of what we call the Cod Trap. And it was developed from a seine, great big net. And the Cod Trap was something that could be positioned in very coastal waters. So this was not an offshore gear. This was a coastal gear. And the Cod Trap tended to catch smaller cod, not the very, very large cod. And the way it worked was that it had a design, as you see here, and you can get a feeling for how it caught the fish here. Essentially, there was what we call a leader that extended towards the shore. Sometimes it attached to shore, sometimes it did not. But the cod would make contact with that leader and come into the box of the trap. Now, even though there was no roof to the trap, the cod stayed there. I'm sure some of them left, but there was enough to catch, as you can see, that it wasn't a big issue. Although in later years, in the 1980s and 1970s, the trap started to have a roof put on the top, a cover. Sort of makes some sense. But at the time, there were so many fish, it wasn't an issue. So the cod trap was a key piece of gear at that time, and the gill net, or what we called the cod net, was also developed in the late 1840s as another way to catch cod. So now we have different types, different ways of catching cod. A baited hook and line, a cod trap, a gill net or a cod net. But these were all what we call passive types of fishing gear. The fish had to swim to make contact with the gear instead of the technology searching for the cod. In the 1800s, we have these types of vessels, these coastal vessels, these schooners. So we didn't have what we call schooners before the 1800s. But then, as the island started to become settled, a few people had some money. They constructed these schooners for the fishery, and that allowed them to expand from coastal Newfoundland further north to Labrador. Now, Labrador is a very barren place, even today. Very, very few people live in Labrador, and very much fewer people lived there at the time. But the fishery started to extend northwards. So whenever one thinks about the history of a fishery, any fishery, it's always useful to think about not just the gear or the technology changes, but the spatial changes. And sometimes those are very important. So these schooners migrated from coastal Newfoundland. They would fish in Labrador in the summer and return to Newfoundland in the autumn, in the same way that the Europeans would across the ocean. But in order to support this financially, those same schooners were used for the developing seal fishery. So seals, harp seals, started to be fished in the late 1700s. So when these schooners were not being used to fish for cod, they were used to fish or hunt seals. And typically what would happen is the schooner or the ship would leave the men on the ice for a day or more than a day, and the men would search for seal pups on the ice. So one must realize that this area, all of this area in the winter, even today, is ice. It's covered with ice. But it's not always safe ice. It's not always very good ice. And the fishery actually became almost industrialized. This is a place called Baffle Harbor in Labrador. And I've shown an arrow where Baffle Harbor was located. This was industrial drying of cod. These are all cod flakes that you see here. Cod are drying on all those. So schooners were going to this remote island, drying their cod in this location before returning back to Newfoundland. And this is a photograph that many people like to look at or like to see, taken around that time, of a young boy named Robert Holloway, and the cod on the right is about 1.7 meters in length, so approximately my height. So these were big fish, even at that time. Back in Newfoundland, cod were drying, they were salted, they were left to dry in the air, in the sun. On the south coast of Newfoundland, there was lots of beaches, pebbly beaches where the cod could be laid out. And I'm struck, and if you look at that photo, this could be Iceland, as this photograph suggests. So similar, so similar. The only difference is the mountains and the flag. Otherwise, it could be the same place. And I think that speaks to a strikingly similar history. From 1900 to 1955, that migratory fishery effectively stopped. There was a little bit back and forth, but not very much. Most of the catch was by Newfoundlanders and Canadians. And the Newfoundland boats in the inshore started to look a little more sophisticated with sails, something that we also see in the Icelandic fishery at roughly that time. But there was still lots of drying of cod, mainly by the women. So as in Iceland, it was the women primarily who were responsible for drying and preparing the fish, or as we say in Newfoundland, making the fish. And you can see this here in a young boy there. In Newfoundland, fishing was the only reason to exist in Newfoundland. It wasn't farming, it was fishing. So places to live and work were constructed wherever it was possible to do so. So this is a place just north of the capital of Newfoundland called St. John's. And in this place called Pooch Cove, you can get a feeling for how extraordinarily intricate and strong these things were. These didn't fall apart in the wind or the snow. And this is a photograph I particularly like for a variety of reasons, but again, it gives you a feeling of how the homes were constructed in small coves, just single families often, with their own place to dry their fish. And then also in the early 1900s, we had the development of much bigger boats, much bigger schooners. that went and fished on the banks, the offshore banks, the Grand Banks. And these were fast vessels, and they caught a lot of fish. So up to this point, up to the early 1960s, or actually the late 1950s, things didn't change a great deal. It was basically catch the fish and dry the fish, salt it, dry it, and sell it that way. And that changed in 1954. In 1954, there was a vessel called the Færtry that was constructed in Scotland. And it was the first trawler that could tow a net or drag a net across the back of the vessel. There were some trawlers before this boat, but they would tow the net from the side of the vessel. And that meant you couldn't catch too many fish or the vessel would tip. So the technological challenge was to construct a vessel that allowed you to catch a lot of fish from the back, from the stern of the vessel. So the Færtry went to the Grand Banks, located here, and tested the net. Saw if it worked or not. Did it work or not? Well, it worked. It worked very well. So between 1955 and 1977, we have our old friends. The French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, fishing back in Newfoundland waters. Now with these big vessels, with these trawlers. But it wasn't just these four. They had company. Altogether, between 1955 and 1977, almost 20 different countries were fishing in Newfoundland waters. And at the time, the jurisdiction was only 6 nautical miles, and then it went to 12 nautical miles, which meant that these vessels, these countries, and particularly the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, France, Spain, they were fishing very close to shore. The people at the time would refer to a sea of lights, a city of lights in the water, because the vessels were so close to the shore and so lit up while they were fishing at night. And it was thanks to Iceland, of course, in 1976 with their third war between the British and Iceland over jurisdictions regarding the fishery that resulted in the extension of the jurisdiction to 200 nautical miles. And that's why things changed in 1977. Not just for Iceland, but for Canada. Canada joined Iceland in 1977 by extending the coastal jurisdiction to 200 nautical miles, which prevented this sort of exploitation of the waters. Nonetheless, those trawlers resulted in very high catches, up to 800,000 metric tons. And remember, the Icelandic catch today of cod is about 240,000. And the fishery was not regulated. There were no quotas, so it was simply whatever was caught was caught. And overfishing occurred extensively. To the extent that if we look at what we call the spawning stock biomass, so this is the weight or the size of the reproductive part of the cod population. From 1962 to 1992, it had declined by 95%. So think of this fishery that I've just been talking about, a 500-year-old fishery. And it's in 30 years, it has declined by 95%. So if we compare cod in 1992, when there was a fishing moratorium, no fishing was permitted, with what it was like in the early 1960s, told you there was a big reduction in population size. The cod were maturing at a smaller size and a younger age. Instead of maturing at 7 years of age, they were maturing at 4 years of age. Instead of 70 centimeters, they were 40 centimeters. The lifespan declined. So cod typically in the past, in the 1950s and 1960s, you could still find cod older than 20 years of age. In 1992, you couldn't find a cod age 10 or 9, actually. So the contribution of eggs by older cod was negligible. So that's the biological, that's the biology behind the collapse. But for the people, it was unimaginable, or equally unimaginable. So July the 2nd, 1992 is when the moratorium occurred. 30 to 40,000 people were put out of work immediately. It is still the single largest job loss in Canada. 10% of the population of Newfoundland left the island in the next 10 years. And it was cost a lot of money. Icelandic kroner, 300 to 450 billion in social assistance payments. So this was costly, not just biologically, but to people and financially. It was the worst thing that could have happened. So, of course, catches became very low. This shows the catches of cod, northern cod, from the late, early 60s. And you can see in 1992, they are very close to zero. So catches were low, and they stayed low for many years. So the catches declined, but the northern cod did not increase. So this shows the biomass, or the population size of northern cod. And you can see, so let's go back to the previous slide, from 1992 onwards, the catches are extremely low, and the population size remained also very low. That's not supposed to happen. That's not supposed to happen. When you reduce fishing pressure, fishery science tells us that populations will bounce back. They will recover. Let's look at Icelandic cod. So this solid line shows the fishing pressure, and you can see the fishing pressure was quite high in the 1990s. But then in about the year 2000, around 2000, 2002, fishing pressure was reduced because the quotas were reduced. The quotas were reduced and the fishing pressure declined. What did the stock size do? Well, Icelandic cod responded positively. So reduced fishing pressure led to an increase in the status of Icelandic cod. That's, in theory, what should happen. And I will say, it's noteworthy to say that today, the fishing pressure, or the fishing mortality rate on Icelandic cod is lower than it's ever been, at least back to 1955. So very good catches are being realized today, I would say, under a good quota management system. Same thing was seen in the North Sea. Fishing mortality went down. North Sea cod rebounded almost immediately, faster than the Icelandic cod, probably because they mature at a younger age. But again, we see reduced fishing pressure, a positive response of the cod. And it's interesting to note that this positive response of the North Sea cod occurred when the water temperatures in the North Sea were at their highest since 1865. So for those who are interested in how climate change or warming temperatures might affect recovery of depleted fish populations, I find this quite interesting. It's simply an observation, but it's an interesting observation. So I put in the title here, Lessons Learned Since the Collapse of Canada's Atlantic Cod. What have we learned? What are the lessons learned? Well, the first question, the ultimate question is, why such a slow recovery? Why have the cod not responded in the way that Icelandic cod and North Sea cod and other fish populations responded? Maybe it's because the water temperatures were quite cool. I won't have many graphs like this, and you could just listen to my words if this seems a bit too much, and it's almost a bit too much for me. But there are 3 indices of water temperature here. The top one is actual water temperature at 100 meters depth on the Grand Banks off Newfoundland. This is interesting. Hopedale, Labrador. So I mentioned that Labrador was and still is very isolated. There was a missionary, a Moravian mission established there in the early 1800s, and the missionaries used to keep track of when the ice would leave the coast. They would keep records of temperatures and also the dates when the ice would depart from the coast. So we call this an ice clearance index from the Moravian missionaries. And then we have air temperatures in St. John's, the capital of Newfoundland, and the air temperature is directly related to the water temperature. So if we just look at the water temperature on the Grand Bank, we might conclude that in 1992, when the moratorium was announced, this was very cold water. Just look at that graph. You can see the water temperature has declined. But what we are interested in, or should be interested in, is not just the short term, but the long term. Were these temperatures unusual or unusually cold for cod over the longer term? And at least for this database, the answer is no. Colder temperatures also existed in the 1920s and 1930s, but the stock did not collapse. The same pattern is true if we look at the ice clearance index off Labrador. So when this line is below the 0 line, it's colder than average. When it's above the line, it's warmer. And again, you can see in the 1800s, it was colder on average than it was when northern cod collapsed. And the same is true of air temperature in St. John's. So again, we're looking at a situation where the water temperatures that existed when the cod collapsed were not unusually cold. So I don't think it can be easily attributed to cold temperature. What about productivity? Now, I call this per capita productivity, or you can think of this as the productivity of individual fish or of the population as a whole. And the idea is that the productivity of each individual, which is based on a cod's chance of surviving and reproducing The idea is that as the population gets smaller and smaller, down here, the productivity of each individual goes up. The chances of reproducing get better and better. And the reason is that as the population gets smaller and smaller, there is less competition for food. There's less competition for resources. And so individuals, a per capita or per individual basis, should experience better survival and better reproduction. So the idea behind this theory is that when populations are small, the individual productivity should be pretty high. And this has led many fisheries scientists and managers to conclude that it's okay if we push fish populations to very low levels because their productivity, per individual productivity, will remain high. Now, some fish species are likely to have relatively high productivity, such as capelin. They have what we call a life history that might lead to high per capita productivity. They reproduce at a small size, at a young age. But cod might have a lower per capita productivity. So the point here is that the likelihood of recovery depends upon the productivity of the species or the population in question. And you can think of this productivity as a compound interest rate. It's exactly the same kind of thing. So different species differ in terms of their ability to recover. That's what the theory says. But what if it looks like this? What if instead of this straight line, which implies that at low population sizes, things are the best they could ever be for each individual, that instead there is some population size below which things start to decline. Things start to get a little worse. A sort of tipping point. So we can think of populations that when they become too small, for different reasons, they might not be able to be as productive as they used to be. If that's true, then we need to be aware of that from a management perspective. We need to try to know where that tipping point might be. So maybe the magnitude of population decline affects recovery. In other words, what is the population when it starts to recover relative to its maximum? We could look at that. We could look at the maximum level populations have been. We can look at how big they were when we started to regulate fishing in a meaningful way and see if that affected recovery. So we can compare the trends of populations that have or have not recovered following a meaningful reduction in fishing. So the black lines represent the change in population size when fishing stopped, when the threat was mitigated, compared to the current situation. So the typical time period that we're talking about between when fishing stopped and where the population is today is about 20 years. So that's quite a long period of time. So these black lines show you the size of a particular population of different fish relative to their maximum when the threat was mitigated compared to today. Now, the thick black line shows you the average trajectory of populations that have recovered, and we can talk about what that definition means later, but let's just accept that they have recovered. And the red line represents the average trajectory or change in population size for those that have not recovered. And you can see that those that have not recovered were about 10% of their maximum when fishing stopped. And on average, they're still 10%. So they haven't changed. So that suggests to me that thinking back to this tipping point idea, that when populations fall below 10% of their maximum, they don't recover as well as they might have. Icelandic cod fell to 13% of their maximum. Northern cod fell to less than 5%.
Is this all cod? Populations of
This is different species, but there are cod in here. What about altered interactions between species? We tend to manage fisheries. In fact, we don't tend to manage fisheries. We do manage fisheries as if the fish in question is the only species in the ecosystem. If it's capelin or haddock or cod, nothing else really matters from a management perspective. But we know from a biological perspective that species do not exist in isolation. They eat each other, they compete with each other. And so we can have situations such that the cod might decline to very low levels, and maybe their ecosystem changes in a way that prevents them from recovering. A good example of this might be what we are experiencing in parts of eastern Canada. Cod in this part of Canada spend the summer in this area, and in the autumn they migrate to this area in the winter, and after the winter is over they move back into this Gulf of St. Lawrence for the summer. There has been no fishery on this cod for 10 years, and the cod are not just stable, they're declining. And it's not just cod. There is a skate that is also declining. There are other fish species that are declining even though there is no fishery. And scientifically, the best explanation, when you consider different reasons or hypotheses for why they are declining, the seal predation hypothesis is the most defensible one. So cod have declined by 400,000 to 35,000 tons, and the gray seals have increased from 10,000 tons in 1968, and this is from this area here, to about 420,000 seals today. And that is because there used to be hunting on seals. If you saw a seal, you could just shoot it, and then you could get some money from the government. And then that stopped. So it could be that we are seeing situations that we have taken cod, that is a top predator in the ecosystem. We have overfished it to very low levels, and at the same time, other species, such as seals, might be replacing cod. Which would mean, and we call this a regime shift. This is just an idea. But some people are starting to think that maybe in some places seals have replaced cod in the ecosystem, which means recovery will be very difficult. And lastly, what about fishing? Is fishing a problem? Well, I think it is. That's the distribution of northern cod. Let's look at this. So here's the northern cod situation in the 1980s. The fishery is closed in 1992. And if you can see these little increases here, that was viewed as a recovery. Positive signs, positive indications. So let's open the fishery. Well, some people, including me, said maybe we shouldn't. And it was the key question then, and it still is today. The key question is you might have a small quota, but the question is how big is the quota compared to the size of the population? And we didn't know what that would be. So we had a fishery, and it turns out that that fishery, a very few fish, 9,000 ton fishery, the fishing mortality level was similar to what was experienced before the collapse. So the point is that when you see some small signs of recovery and you reopen a fishery, even at a very low level, it can still have a dramatic impact if the population is depressed. So that's what the Index of Cod, and this is for Bjarne, this is what the Index of Cod looked like from 1994 to 1999. This was the positive sign of recovery. This is why the fishery needed to be reopened. And let's put a box around those years, and then we go back to 1992 when the fishery was closed, and that increase doesn't look quite as impressive. And if we go back to 1982, when the Canadian fleet had fully implemented its trawler capacity, it looks less impressive. And if we go back to 1962, that recovery looks less impressive even still. In other words, we need to think about history. We need to think about what has happened in the past. And the past is sometimes a long period of time. So where are we today with northern cod? Northern cod didn't show any recovery, and now it's starting to show some positive signs, although in the most recent year, it's actually dipped down a little bit. There is something called a limit reference point in fisheries, and if population hasn't reached its limit reference point, you should not fish it, in theory. And that's where the limit reference point is for northern cod. Some people have called this a comeback. The media have called it a comeback. Some scientists have called it a comeback. I call that a good sign, but I don't think I call it a comeback. But the fishing industry calls it a comeback. And this shows the catch and how the catch has changed during this period of extremely low abundance. And the catch has been going up. And that is because of the way in which quotas are set in Canada. There's a very strong link between the managers and the industry. And science provides advice, but it's quite secondary in terms of its influence on the quotas. So now we are almost back to where we were 25 years ago. And who knows what the future will look like for northern cod. But as long as the catches go up, it won't be good. So to finish up, I think it's always useful to remind ourselves that the cod are not just there for the industry or the government. They're there actually for all of us, for those who don't fish, those who do fish, those who fish by different types of gear, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal fishers. And in Canada, there was a a decision made by our highest court 20 years ago that reminded us that the fisheries are a common property resource. They belong to all of the people, not just a sector. They belong to everyone. And the court went on to say that it's the minister, the fisheries minister's duty to manage, conserve, and develop the fisheries on behalf of all Canadians in the public interest. It applies in every parliamentary democracy. But it's not always stated, and we don't always remember it, but we should. We should remind people, politicians sometimes, that this is their obligation and that these are a common property resource in any parliamentary democracy. So with that, I'd like to finish by simply saying I hope I've given you a feeling for the historical context of the cod fisheries in Canada, maybe drawing some of your own links to the Icelandic situation, giving you a sense of the magnitude of the collapse and what has happened to the cod in Newfoundland since then, and why it has or has not recovered to the extent that we thought it would. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.